Hello and welcome to the Beyond the Best podcast, the podcast that looks into the world of elite athletes. We look at the journeys and the challenges they may face to get to the very top that we often may not think about. Today's episode is all about families and elite athletes. We'll be talking about how they're their support system, how they deal with travelling away, the sacrifices that families have to make in order for their loved one to become an elite athlete, and so many other topics that we potentially don't think about when it comes to the person that we see on the TV screen and the people they've got around them. So what is a family to an athlete? These are the people that have probably been there from day one. They're not always the parents, they usually are, but these people have seen the athletes come from literally taking their first steps in their sport to seeing them take the world stage and achieving some incredible things. Families really know these athletes more than we could possibly ever imagine, obviously. These people are not elite athletes to them. They're a loved one who have excelled very well in their sport and are very happy for them. It's a great thing. I think often it's easy to forget how much of a significant role families have actually played in an athlete's life in order to get them to where they are. Athletes tend to be children or very young when they start getting involved in the sport they then excel in. It's just how it is, the way that the sporting timeline works. You start young, you perform young, and your career's usually over relatively young as well. And that's just the way of the world. So families are so important in order to get you started and be the support network that you require in order to really do well. This may be in terms of financial support, logistical support, emotional support, or even managerial support. Lewis Hamilton is famous for having his dad pretty much make his career for him as he was going up through the ranks in karting all the way through to F1. He was his mechanic, he was his taxi, he was his dad, he was his business manager. There were so many things that his dad took on as a role in order for his child to absolutely dominate the world of motorsport. But then we saw, as Lewis Hamilton made it into the F1, he parted ways as his dad as a manager. He was quoted saying that he lost his father figure. And that is very interesting because it makes you realise that whilst you need your family around you to support you, guide you, push you in the early years, when you've kind of made it or you've got to where you need to be with that support, you really just need your family. You need the people who know you for your good traits, your bad traits. They're happy to take the mick out of you. And more importantly, don't see you as a money maker. They're not having to make decisions on your behalf or with you in order to gain money. And I think that relationship is very precious and can be easily broken if outside pressures, business pressures get involved. As I mentioned earlier, another aspect of being a part of a family with an elite athlete is understanding that you are going to have to make some sacrifices. It is very well documented and it's very rare that you will ever hear an athlete not talk about the sacrifices they've had to make in order to get to where they are. But it's very easy to forget that these people are not alone in that journey to success. There's been families, there's been friends around them that has had to take the second seat in order for them to do what is required to reach these levels. And when you think about that as a family member, if you just look at who you've got, how often do you do family events, Christmas, birthdays, holidays, all of that? How much enjoyment do you get out of that? Because every single person in your close circle is there and experiencing those happy memories with you. But if you have an elite athlete in your close-knit circle, you're going to have to accept that that person is going to miss out on that. And that is a huge thing to deal with. And it may say, like, on paper, it may not look that big of a deal, but the specialness around these events is the fact that you get to make the memories. And you then don't get to make these memories with these people. And that's what you want more than anything. And to be able to make that sacrifice, knowing it's in aid of making the athlete in your family to be able to pursue their dreams, I think that is an incredible thing to do. And actually, you don't hear anyone complain about it. Rightly so. Like, there is no reason that you would complain about it, because why would you complain about the fact that there's someone that you care deeply about pursuing their dreams? But the idea that you just sort of have to sit back and go, okay, that's fine. Like, we'll miss out on all these events with you because you're going to do this. Well, hopefully we'll get it another time. Imagine having to become used, like, you have to get used to that. That's just the reality of it. That's difficult. I think that's really difficult. And even for example, in the NBA and the NFL, there are games played on Christmas Day. Like, imagine, I know a lot of people have to work on Christmas Day, and for anyone having to not have a loved one around on such a special occasion is really quite sad. I think it's very interesting that the athlete lifestyle is glamorized and made to be amazing and bring all these opportunities, which it does. But we never really sit and think about the sacrifices that the athletes and then their families have to make in order for them to have this lifestyle. And I think it's very easy to sort of say, well, they get paid all this money, it's fine, it's whatever, like, I'm sure they can live without it. But not everyone gets paid the money, and they still have to make those sacrifices. There are many sports that involve traveling, competitions around like holidays or even on the holidays. And I wouldn't have said their like finances really cover it. But even if they did, LeBron James in the NBA, he could be playing on Christmas Day or New Year's Eve, and their families kind of just go, okay, what? That's crazy to me. Like, I think the point I'm trying to make is it's one thing an athlete making that decision and making those sacrifices for themselves, which is fine. Like, you come to that for yourself and understand, I'm doing this for me to pursue my dreams and it's worth it. But the families, did sign up for it. But they only signed up for it because they wanted their loved one to do well. If you asked them if they had a choice, would they accept that they missed out on really important events and holidays? And I'm pretty sure if you told them that it did not affect their careers, they would all go, yeah, I don't want them to do that. And I think that is something we should think about, because I don't believe an athlete really gets to where they are without the support system of their family. And the athlete gets all the credit when they succeed. But they wouldn't have done that if they didn't have their families behind them, accepting and willing to make the exact sacrifices that the athletes also had to take. So maybe I'm rambling a bit on this one, but I'm just saying, I think it's a topic we don't talk about. Why do we never talk about the family sacrifice of the athlete? Why is the athlete always doing everything and achieving everything by themselves when so much has gone into getting them there? Yes, they have done the hard work, but I'm not quite sure they would have been there able to do the hard work if they didn't have the constant support network around them, enabling them to make those sacrifices and still have a supporting environment around them. Maybe that's the point I'm trying to make. Families are blooming awesome, yeah? Moving on from this slightly and accepting that we're going to have to make some sacrifices, how does a family balance having an athlete in their circle, whether that be a younger athlete who is part of a wider family or an athlete who has actually got a family of their own? How do you do that when you need to be going off to training camps for months at a time? Or if you're traveling around to, for instance, in athletics with the Diamond League, they do competitions every few weeks. Like, they are traveling all through Europe and across the world to make these competitions. How do you still stay an integral and key part of your family when you are physically not there? Yes, there's many jobs out there that have the same situations, and I think in the times we're in right now, it's amazing because you have the likes of FaceTime and phones and all of that. But is it really the same? Like, if you've got a young family, do they really understand your face on a screen? And then how do you navigate that? How do you explain that to the younger people that whilst this person may not be around, they are still your family. They miss events, but they're still your family. And it must be really difficult, especially when I would say that the athlete actually does want to, who wants to miss the growing up of their young family? Who wants to miss big family events? How do you get that mindset to push yourself and make those decisions to walk away effectively from the family unit in order to better yourself? Is there a motivation there going, that actually this is for everyone around me, this is benefiting my family, and as a result of that, they're going to get less time with me? Or is it the drive to succeed within their sport is just so great that it's bigger than the guilt or sadness that comes with leaving a family? And I think will vary across many athletes, and it would be really interesting to find out their reasoning behind it. The point I'm making is There are a lot of athletes with families and they manage it. But how and who really suffers the most? Is it the athlete because they are the ones missing out? Or is it the family because they are missing a key member of their unit? And at what point does that decision on choosing to be away from your family, does it ever get to a point where the sport is no longer worth it? Are they coming towards an end of their career where, yes, they could keep going a few more years, but actually the years they're missing out on are far more important to be around than it is the sport? Is that why we see some people retire earlier than what they necessarily need to do? Is because they realise that their priorities have probably shifted a little bit. And I think it does come down to priorities, and not in a negative way. I think it's very easy to say, oh, sport or your sport is your biggest priority. You don't care about the family, when that's not the case. You can care about something hugely, but you can care about something else that tiny bit more. So it is really difficult, and I'm sitting here trying to play devil's advocate, but I don't know myself, because how could you possibly even bring those conversations to your significant other or the person in your family and be like, do you know what? I want you around. You need to put your dreams on hold. Like, how do you do that? And I'm not sure you do. And that's probably how you work around it. It's going, we're never going to have that conversation. So we need to find and make ways, creative ways on how we solve that. And maybe you create events or situations so when you are home and you can look forward to that and you do special things and have those special moments that the average family potentially wouldn't do because they get to be around each other all the time. But you do have to think about it, because it's tricky. It's really, really tricky. I've spent a lot of time on potentially the negatives of the family environment and how family is impacted by an athlete's career, but I think it's also important to talk about the positives and the positive effects of having an athlete of that standard within the family network. I think on the whole, the average person is not fully able to comprehend the amount of dedication, discipline, motivation an individual has to possess in order to apply themselves hard enough to actually maintain their elite levels. I believe physically there are a lot of people who can make elite level status and is capable of doing so, but I do think it's the mental part that actually makes or breaks the elite athletes and the people that don't do that, but then also even more so the people who can maintain that, because it's one thing getting yourself there, and I think sometimes that can be made to see like the biggest challenge, but maintaining that, I think, is probably more difficult, because you now need to find new motivation to keep yourself there. A lot of people are hungry to keep succeeding, and maybe that is a mindset that many athletes possess that most people don't, and that's the difference between us. But it really has to be who you are to the core of you. And if you have someone like that in your family unit, I struggle to understand how that could possibly not rub off on you. Imagine watching someone get up and make sacrifices, apply themselves in training, pushing themselves to the absolute limits, and keep making those decisions to do so in order to get better. How much better of a role model could you possibly ask for? And as much as there is the sacrifice and there's the things that, the negatives that does come with that, but there is negatives for a lot of people in a lot of other job roles, granted. But imagine having and growing a family or having young people around an athlete who is doing so well for themselves, and then that's what you've got to look up to. That's, you can learn off that person. Like, how amazing is that? That is just incredible to me, where a child is exposed to that level of discipline in so many areas of their lives. And the thing is, it's so translatable as well. Like, these people don't have to be just building, like, oh my gosh, your parents an athlete, that means your only chance is to, like, you're going to get it easy in the athlete world. No, like, yes, okay, you might have a step up because there's some experience and you've got someone who can show you the ropes early on, but the same with a lawyer or a doctor. Like, a child has got a better chance of knowing that area too. If you're taught those absolute fundamental skills on how to apply yourself, push yourself when you don't want to, like schoolwork, degree work, exams, in any form of career choice that you take, you will have that instilled in you from a very young age. And from my very limited experience around, well, just being a person growing up, I think that makes or breaks a person is the role models they have around them. And I think at school, you can tell the people who had very driven families around them versus people who potentially just didn't want to be that driven or didn't. And that's fine. That is completely fine. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. But how amazing is it for a young person and a child to have that sort of person in their close-knit area to look up to and learn from? It's incredible. And I think that's something, like, athletes, they have so many effects on so many people and it's all role models to so many others, but they also have families of their own. And it's pretty cool that they can be a role model to the people they care about as well, not just the fans and the following. I keep saying this, I just don't think we talk about the impact that an athlete has on a family and the family on the athlete enough. And in my head, when I look at an athlete, I look at it as a unit. I look at it as a team. No one really gets to where they are without the people behind them. And I think it is so cool that there are groups of people out there that are benefiting from one person excelling to amazing levels, and the younger people or even the people who love them and care for them are benefiting from it too. And that's really nice to know that there's more than one purpose. And I think that's really cool. It's a really cool thought. As I mentioned earlier, an athlete's career typically really isn't as long as the average person's working career. Like, they're not going to be playing sport until they're 65, 70. Like, their bodies are just not built to do that. So how does a family ensure that an athlete is supported and is given everything that is needed for them to do extremely well in their sport, but then also they've got options for when their sport career is finished and they've retired from that? And I think that probably comes from when they're really young and they're exploring this new sport that they're getting into that they're clearly very good at. But I think it comes from an element of realism and being quite pragmatic about needing an education, needing other skills beyond the sport. And you do see it, like, parents will wake up at 4 a.m. in the morning to take their children swimming and compete in all these galas over the weekend. But school is very important. And I think it's very easy for a parent to get completely, I mean, you only have to look at things like dance moms, completely wrapped up in their child excelling in this one thing. And then what happens? Their career's over and they have nothing. A family's role ensuring that doesn't become a reality for their loved one is huge, because rightly so, an athlete needs to be completely focused on their career, what they're doing in that moment. I think it's the family's job, therefore, to sort of ground them a little bit, being like, okay, cool, like we're nailing this, but let's nurture some of the like soft skills. Like, what are your interests? Let's see if we can get things in place to make sure that is not going to be a problem when you move on from the sport. And maybe that's why you see a lot of people go into pundits or having a bigger presence on social media or in the public eyes, because they've realised actually that their sport is coming to an end and they still need an income. Like, yes, there are some sports that you do your career and that's it, you're done. You really don't need to work again. It's not the case for a lot of sports. And I think it's the family's job to make sure that this athlete isn't going to have a big fall off the cliff when they've come to the end of it. It is not their responsibility. Granted, it needs to always come from the athlete. But I don't think there's anything wrong with a family being like, let's give you the roots to grow. Let's help you and excel in your sport. But then let's also be there for you when you need to bounce back some ideas about what we're going to do next. Is there anything else that we could put in the pipeline to make sure that I've got some longevity in a career that I'm passionate about as well? I think it's quite a small point, but it's also very important, because I do think it really does create some serious foundations for the dynamic between an athlete and their family. How do they build a relationship where the athlete can rely on them for emotional support, but also to an extent where they can give them a bit of tough love to go, do you know what, like, I don't think what you're doing is okay, or I really think you need to start thinking about X, Y, and Z so we don't have an issue in the future. I think elite athletes can be surrounded by teams of yes men. I think that's the same for anyone who is doing very well and having a lot of success. No one really wants to tell them no, because they don't want to be booted out of the little clique that's going on. And it does take a family, someone that's a bit like, well, you're not going to boot me out, are you really? Like, you've got me around no matter what, so I'm going to tell you how I feel. And maybe that's a good thing. And I'm sure there are a lot of people or a lot of sports people who have had tough conversations with their family, who've probably become a bit too closed eyes, or they've put their blinkers on because of right now, they're doing amazingly well, but it unfortunately doesn't last forever. But I guess a family does, and that's the amazing thing about the family. It can be that guidance when potentially the athlete isn't on a road that's exposing them to those thoughts. I touched on it briefly, and I think a family's role in an elite athlete's journey to success is incredibly important. But I think the biggest role and impact they have on an athlete is their ability to be there for an emotional support when things go amazingly well. The celebration means a lot because they've been through everything together. But I think most importantly, when the pressure is on, times are a bit more negative than what they need to be, everyone wants to be around you when you're doing well. It's amazing how many of those people are not around when you're not doing so well. And a family is. They really are. And I think it'd be really interesting to understand the strategies an athlete has put in place, or a family's even put in place, to communicate themselves when they're not feeling amazing, if they're going through hard time, if they're under a lot of pressure. That's hard to talk about in the moment. So how do you, as a family member, watch your loved one, I don't want to say suffer because I don't think they're suffering, but if they're trying to work it out, that's never going to be an easy thing to do. And no matter what situation you're in, if you're watching a family member struggle, that's really hard, especially when you don't necessarily have the answers. So how do families put strategies in place? How do you be there for a loved one when you don't have the answers? And I'd say that's probably a big problem for a lot of people all over the world, no matter the situation. Like, everyone has their demons, and there's a lot of families out there that struggle to work out their role in helping that person. I think the unconditionality of most families is the reason they are the best support networks an athlete can have. Sometimes if an athlete is doing really well, there can be this pressure to put on a brave face and act like things aren't that big of a deal. But families, they know you so much deeper than that, don't they? They've seen you do things that when you were younger you hope never get out again, but always make it out eventually at some family event. But then I think it's an ego thing, I guess, isn't it, as well? Because you can't have an ego with your family. If you're feeling rubbish, like, who are you to put a brave face on in front of them? They can see straight through it anyway. But I do wonder how many athletes do use their families for support, or do they just internalize it because they feel like that's what the role of the job is and that's what they should do. Like, everyone goes through negatives and they just have to deal with it. Is it a male-female thing? Is there a difference between how a male's going to handle it and a female's going to handle it? I'm probably going to say yes, there is, without a doubt. Especially, I think, a male in a family environment where he's got his own family, where I think it's very difficult to express feelings of sadness or emotion. I don't know. It's a tricky one. It really is. Like, every single person knows what they need in order to feel better. If that is then affecting performance, at what point does the family member step in and go, do you know what? I don't think what you're doing is correct here. I think you need some support. But you can't force someone to do it, can you? Because no one wants to see anyone sad, and it's even harder when you know you are not the person that either the athlete wants to lean on or is able to lean on. So is it something that they've developed over time and they've realised because their families have been there from day one, that you've built on it and you've had lesser negatives happen, or you've had smaller problems come out and you've learned that you've dealt with it in this way? So when the bigger challenges come, because it's on a much bigger scale, you think, hang on, it is bigger here, but we can still go through it together. And communication is the best form of solving all problems, isn't it? Problem shared is a problem halved. I think sometimes it can, especially when there's pressures of sponsorship and funding and image, which is a huge part of sport that you cannot deny. How do you talk to someone about that when they do not have that pressure on them, and it can seem like it's impossible to run away from? But I do think families are the answer. I think a close-knit people who just don't judge you. And I think that's the hardest thing, though, is understanding that they don't judge you. They really don't. They care about you more than they care about the sport. And it's hard to say, and it comes across slightly like they just don't care. They do, but at the end of the day, they would rather you give that up in a heartbeat for your own happiness. It's vital to have that in your circle in order to succeed, because the only way you're going to get better in your sport is if your head's in a good place. And if you keep bottling things up, when the pressure's turned on, your brain is going to explode. And I've seen it firsthand that happen. And you see it all the time when people just, you only have to look at Anthony Joshua when he lost his titles. There was explosion inside his head. I don't know the personal situation, but how much did he talk about what he was going through and the pressure he was feeling, and who did he talk to? Or are you talking to your yes men team, or are you talking to the people who subconsciously you will never have an ego around, so you can be truly honest and say the honest things and actually go and get honest responses? I'm very passionate about this topic because I think sport is probably one of the biggest places in the world that really is bad at talking about feelings and accepting negatives for what they are and moving on. Athletes are heavily criticised and demonised if they do the smallest thing wrong. But if you equated that in a workplace, their little mistake or not doing something, it would be brushed off and forgotten about. It's just not the same. And I think that is a huge difference. And it cannot help with the pressure and the mental health aspect of being an athlete within sport. So it goes back, is that a family is needed more than anything in these situations, because they absolutely need someone to lean on, whether they like it or not. The issue is sometimes they just don't lean on them. As we come towards the end of this podcast, I think it'd just be interesting to have a look to see the athletes who have nailed being part of a family unit while they've excelled through sport. And if I think of the clearest one to me has got to be LeBron James and his family. I think you have to be very careful about what I say, because everything I've seen is through social media. But you can tell his family is his absolute core of his world. And yes, he is incredibly passionate and incredibly good at what he does. He broke the record last year of scoring the most ever points, and he brought his family onto the court and celebrated together as a family because it was their achievement, not just his. That is a mindset that he has. It just shows that the communication, the sacrifices, the difficult times, they can navigate it and have navigated it so well that he is able to be where he is today in his career and have the family he has. He has also got children who are at university and on the brink of being in the NBA themselves. I don't want to say it's perfection, because I don't think we should put someone on that pedestal, but it really does seem like he has nailed being part of a family and having a family. You hear so much about the way he talks about his mum and the appreciation he has for what she did and the sacrifices she made. I think he's a perfect example of everything I've spoken about today. Understanding that families are there when you need to switch off and forget about the sport, but also they're there when you are succeeding and absolutely doing amazing things. They're there by your side too. And I think that's the point I want to leave with, is families are incredible and amazing because they put up with so much sacrifice, but they are absolutely guaranteed to be there in every single point of your journey, whether you like it or not. But they are. And I think that's something you cannot shun, because there are a lot of people who aren't that lucky, and to be able to have that dynamic is incredible. So shout out to all the families of elite athletes, and also shout out to the elite athletes who put in that extra bit of work to keep that family dynamic good and healthy. And it's actually sometimes just a bit easier to step away a little bit and try and do the journey by yourself, thinking it's probably best for everyone. It's food for thought. The whole reason I'm doing this podcast is to sort of generate some thoughts that we potentially don't think about when we see the mainstream media around elite sport and athletes. So I hope you've really enjoyed this podcast. Make sure to follow me on Instagram, YouTube, and you can listen to this on Spotify as well. And until next time, I hope you have an amazing week, and I'll speak to you very soon.